So this is the rugged software development session. I'll explain in a minute what rugged is. It's going to be a little bit of a hybrid. I'm going to go at 1,000,000 miles an hour through a slide deck to leave room for some good discussion with some informed folks. So we're also passing around rugged stickers because it's not a cool meme unless it has stickers. But essentially, I'm Joshua Corman. I'm the research director for the 451 analyst group, specifically the enterprise security practice. I took that job in October. I'm actually not much into the analyst community. Been pretty hard on the analyst community for the last several years, but have been very passionate about security. So I decided that this was a good time with a bad economy and way too much cost and complexity that people might actually listen to some fresh thinking. So I'm trying to bring that and drive a little novel thought and try to be more strategic about the way we approach security. I talk to easily 1,000 CISOs a year, partly through my old job at IBM, and also partly due to work I do for the Institute for Applied Network Security out of Boston here, but lots of peer-to-peer roundtables. So your customers or the people you work for complain to me about what's wrong with security. I synthesize that, I summarize that, and I'm trying to do some good things about that. So I physically cannot do a security talk unless I do my 5 arrows first, but this came from talking to those thousands of CISOs over the last few years. This was basically just a shorthand that a CIO, a CFO, a CSO can talk to about security. And essentially the center of the bullseye here is cost and complexity. So I got into security because I want to fight bad guys. I want to be a superhero. Do not look very good in tights, but that's pretty much why a lot of us got in. There's some sort of history as to how we got here. I used to get brought in and talk about sophisticated malware. I did malware stuff at a stealth startup. All of a sudden, no one cared about sophisticated malware. All they cared about was the middle there, way too much cost and complexity. So in 2007, if you do industry surveys, about 4% of an IT budget was spent on security, 4% security tax. By 2009, it was like 12.6%. And that was before the economic downturn. So essentially, the CISOs ran out of money, can't keep adding more security on the stack. There are 70 security products right now. It's way too many. The market won't bear it, it won't sustain it. And when you pair that with a bad economy, it's fundamentally altered the way spending and security has been approached. So the center of the bullseye here is not the latest rootkit, it's not Google China, it's not even PCI, it's how do we drive down that cost complexity? It's vendor consolidation, it's simplification, it's fewer products, etc. Now, where does that cost complexity come from? Well, that's the problem. We really haven't been paying attention to that. So, like I said, I got into security because I want to fight bad guys. So the evolving threat was really how most of this industry started. Think back to 1984 and the brain virus. I mean, it was sneaker net. It wasn't like blinding infection velocity, right? But that's where we started. And now we have very, very sophisticated, politically motivated, criminally motivated folks, et cetera. But you guys know this. What bothers me, and is the focus of my talk next week at Interop, is that compliance has completely eclipsed the threat landscape as the #1 driver of spending. We now fear the auditor more than the attacker. I mean, we are far more afraid of PCI than we are of Google China, right? And I'm not saying FUD's a good thing. But this used to be our North Star, and now compliance has actually competed for and dominated other forms of risk. Technology changes pretty often too. It's less often but more dramatic in impact. So what this might mean is x86 virtualization changes the way we have to deploy our legacy controls. Cloud computing, SaaS, iPhones, Blackberries, Twitter, frickin' Farmville. The pinnacle of human innovation is Farmville, guys, right? But technology has tremendous benefit, but also fundamentally impacts our risk posture and how many products we got to buy. The economics before the downturn economy really meant that there's a shift in CapEx spending to OpEx spending. There was the effects of globalization. There were just different factors in the environment, in the industry, where we were spending money differently, accounting for things differently, and it became a constraint for how we solved the first three. But really, when you talk to a C-level, they don't care about any of those four. All they care about is, what does my board of directors want? What do my shareholders want? What does my CEO want? What's going on in my industry? If it's healthcare, they care about the digitization of records. If it was banking a couple of years ago, it was M&A and integrating all your acquisitions. But the confluence of these things has ballooned security from 4% of our budgets to 12% of our budgets. And it's only going to keep getting bigger if we don't do something smarter. So typically I ask people to, no matter what the trigger is, if it's a threat change like Google China, if it's a technology change like SaaS adoption, marshal your way through and ask the right questions around these. The best example I used to use was After Hurricane Katrina, the business decided, it was a board of directors decision, to do a disaster recovery program. Well, if you look at the economics, it would be financially irresponsible to build a fully redundant physical data center. So you go to technology and you embrace a nascent, unproven x86 virtualization technology, of which most of your legacy security controls don't work yet. And then, by the way, you have all this fun stuff like live migration and dynamism in offline systems and offline patching, and it becomes more complex. And the bad guys take advantage of our diminished security posture. But more important than the bad guys, the auditors also still, 6 years after people started adopting this stuff, still won't tell you how to adopt it in a compliant way. There's still no guidance from even PCI. So people would deploy these and find themselves getting fined for deploying it improperly. So if you don't really marshal your way through, you can't really drive that down. So thank you for tolerating the stump speech, but I can't have a conversation about security without us understanding that we are beset on all sides by constant and turbulent change. So how does that bring us to rugged? Well, I was talking to two other guys and lamenting last year at RSA. I don't know about you, but if you go to RSA each year, I want to quit security at RSA. And it's basically that we have a highly volatile, ever-changing landscape, like I just described in the previous slide, but we have an incredibly static and unchanging approach. If you take the keynotes from last year, or 2 years ago, or 4 years ago, remove the soundbite like cloud, or APT, or GRC, virtualization, and it's going to be the exact same speech. It's pathetic. So I was lamenting with these two guys at the Greylock party, and I said, you know, when are we ever going to get smarter? We just keep fighting the heads of the Hydra instead of going for the heart. We put out thousands and thousands of patches for thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities. And, you know, hooray for web app firewalls, and no offense to anyone in here who sells them or uses them, but I was also fairly upset because web app firewalls had a very, very good year because they were anointed by the PCI Council. Whereas other really relevant technologies were taking a beating last year because they weren't required. Out of those 70 product markets I mentioned before, 8 categories are required. That means there's 8 winners and 62 losers. So I was pretty upset, and I just met Jeff Williams, who's here in the middle. He's the chair of OWASP. And David Rice and I have been friends for a few years. He's the author of Geekonomics. He's a former Navy intelligence guy and NSA crypto guy. He wrote a pretty good book called Geekonomics. I disagree with parts of it, and I liked others. And I said, you know, until we can actually change the hearts and minds of the people making software, we're going to eternally be band-aiding all this stuff. So I went back to that Hydra, right? So we can have thousands and thousands of patches for thousands and thousands of holes in software, or we can try to get to the root cause. We're never going to make software perfect. I have no delusions about that. But I said, good for you, Jeff. You're the chair of OWASP. Awesome. You've been preaching to the choir, and 1% of the programmers on the planet are really, really well informed about the top 10 OWASP flaws. Awesome. You're doing a great job. But for us to be successful, we got to get to the other 99%. And that wasn't really a negative message. We were being surly because we were upset by all the keynotes. So Rice said, you know what we're missing is we don't have a meme. So if you don't know what a meme is, just gaze at that for a little while. No one has a great definition for a meme. But to me, a meme is really just a contagious idea, a contagious philosophy or value set. Some work, some don't. Maybe rugged will fall on the ground and just wither and die. Maybe it'll be sticky and it'll actually tap into someone's brain or value set. So far, it's been pretty sticky. So here's an example of a meme, right? I'm going to go really quickly. So the pirates are attacking the U.S. ships off the coast of Africa. They've broken a 100-year truce, right? What the pirates know, the internet memes. First, it starts with pirates, then zombies, then unicorn-riding robots. Next, there's bloodthirsty lolcats jumping out of rafflecopters and nom-nomming on our tracheas, right? According to internet lore, there's only one thing that can stop a pirate. What, scurvy? Or remedial reading comprehension test? Anyone know the answer? What can stop a pirate? Ninjas, right? All right, so basically that's an example of an internet meme, but there's all sorts of memes, and some of them catch on. It might be some kid in New Jersey wearing his baseball cap sideways. Next thing you know, a kid in South Africa is doing the same thing. They never met. It's really just these contagious concepts or archetypes in the human brain. So, you know, beyond that, we've kind of hit a turning point, and I'm not trying to use FUD. I'm actually quite allergic to FUD. In fact, if you come to my B-Sides talk, I'm going to do a frontal assault on FUD in the echo chamber. But you know, Google China got some attention, some other things like this. So essentially the point is, and anyone who's ever heard me talk before says we can't continue to hide behind our firewalls, right? We have a very Gen 1 technology against a very, you know, Gen 1 plus threat. And yet our oldest technologies like firewall and antivirus, the ones getting the most spending, thanks to these compliance mandates, right? So we have our geriatric oldest controls against our most modern, sophisticated adversaries. You gotta love it. And I'm not saying they're useless. I'm not one of the Luddites here that's just saying we gotta get rid of everything. But everyone that tells me that we have to clutch onto these, because what if we let go? We might get attacked by a macro virus from 1986 or something. They're forgetting that we're prone and exposed to lots of attacks. It's just you have to choose which ones you want to be exposed to. And honestly, I'd welcome a macro virus right now. So, the Department of Defense is kind of slowly figuring this out. I'm going to go, this is the faster version, but these slides are online, so you can take a look at these later. But even the usually way behind the times cyber folks in the military and the government are starting to kind of catch on to this. So really what we said is, what's our meme going to be? You have Agile. Initially, this wasn't really to be a fight with Agile. I know some very smart security professionals that say Agile is the antithesis of secure software. I have other people like, Dr. Michael Howard at Microsoft are basically using Agile to bake security into their process. So you'll see later I kind of look at the frameworks indifferently. I think any of the frameworks or methodologies can be rugged. But if this is current software, this is rugged software. We debuted this in San Francisco, so we try to use some San Francisco lingo. If this is current software, this is rugged software, right? Le car. Oh, wait, there you go. Rugged. So software needs to be fast, right? We know that. It needs to be agile, whether you're using that framework or not. But it also really needs to be rugged, right? So what do we mean by rugged? The other problem I had is security professionals tend to be very demeaning, very condescending to the developer population. And I think that's wrong. I mean, if you want someone to do a better job, you don't tell them they're a stupid idiot, right? And that's all we were doing. We're saying they're ignorant, they're negligent, they don't care, they're not listening. So rugged was really meant to be more aspirational. The truth is, our software finds itself in very harsh environments. It's just reality. We like to think the internet is a super highway, but it's really a battlefield, right? It's a very harsh and hostile environment. It's unfriendly. And yes, that is moving. It's not just your fatigue. So I'm going to skip this point. But yeah. So we said, Agile has a manifesto. And the reason I did this is during the many cocktails at the Greylock party at RSA last year, I busted out my little BlackBerry and I did a search on the Agile manifesto. The word security doesn't show up once. The word risk doesn't show up once. Adversary, not once. Think of any name, not once. The entire Agile site. And I wasn't mad at them. I just said, they're developing in a worldview that does not recognize a hostile, threatening, determined adversary environment. So we're going to make a manifesto. So here's our manifesto. Please pardon the poetic language here. It's very personal language on purpose. So this targeted the development community. I am rugged. And more importantly, my code is rugged. I recognize that software has become a foundation of our modern world. I recognize the awesome responsibility that comes with this foundational role. This is my favorite. I recognize that my code will be used in ways I cannot anticipate, in ways it was not designed, and for longer than it was ever intended. I recognize my code will be attacked by talented and persistent adversaries who threaten our physical, economic, and national security. I recognize these things, and I choose to be rugged. I am rugged because I refuse to be a source of vulnerability or weakness. I am rugged because I assure my code will support its mission. I am rugged because my code can face these challenges and persist in spite of them. I am rugged not because it is easy, but because it is necessary, and I am up for the challenge. That's the Rugged Manifesto. So we don't think a little pledge of 10 lines is actually going to change the world, but what we really wanted to do was plant a seed and make someone on a personal level flip a bit in their brain that says, hey, I'm writing code, might as well make it rugged code, or I didn't realize people were attacking my code. So this was the idea to begin the contagious value set. So let me explain more specifically what we mean. So Bruce Lee learned all the different styles. It's not like, your tiger kung fu is better than my whooping crane kung fu or whatever. He learned them all, destroyed them all, and basically made his own. So we really don't care about your style. We care about the outcome. So there's a whole lot of religion in the space about you got to use this framework or that one's not good, or their top 10 list sucks. Don't care. We just want people to want and treasure and vote with their wallets software that's more rugged than other code. It's certainly, if you know me, it's definitely not about compliance, right? I'm not big on the thou shalt kind of stuff. It's not that you must and you shall not, you shall not. So someone asked me, how's this different than other stuff like BSIM or other frameworks and methodologies, and how's it different than OWASP? Well, first and foremost, most of our efforts are preaching to the single-digit % that already understands and values this. So they don't need to know how to do it until they want to do it, right? They have to value it. So first and foremost, we have to get beyond the choir, right? We're doing a very good job, have very mature tools. There's a lot of products, there's a lot of technologies, there's a static analysis, dynamic analysis, fuzzers. There's services, there's products, there's stuff baked in at the coding life cycle. So SDL and whatnot, there's plenty of stuff, technology, but it's really more about this. For this effort and initiative to have success, it has to get beyond the people who would come to Source. You are the choir. People who go to OWASP, they are absolutely the choir. So if all we do is talk amongst ourselves, this will be a failure. The second thing is it has to be about people, right? The people process technology trilogy, or trinity rather, was brilliant to put people first and technology last. But like good little addicts, we always go straight to technology, right? So if we don't have people who understand why I should want rugged code, why I should buy rugged code, why I should choose rugged code, deploy it, craft it, ship it, then all the technology in the world won't matter. It's fundamentally about values. And lastly, instead of being negative and looking for the worst in people, we're trying to look for the best in people. A lot of the developers I worked with the first couple years of my career, they're some of the only people who actually use their undergrad degree for their real job, right? They take quite a bit of pride in their work. They're some of the best problem solvers I ever met. And since they got me into Dungeons and Dragons and World of Warcraft and stuff like that, they also like terms like agile and rugged, So we don't necessarily think we're going to do this in a year or 5 years. In fact, David says, look, we're going to have software 100 years from now. If it takes 100 years, it's worth starting now. So we know we want to get to the moon, don't necessarily know how to get to the moon, but what we're doing is when we share this kind of concept, interesting and talented individuals are coming out of the woodwork to offer their insight, their connections, their network, their strengths and weaknesses, their failures. I learned about this group in the New England area called AppSec. I didn't know about it before. They tried this. They had some successes, some failures, and now they're willing to put some wood and some help and effort behind this again. So it's aspirational in nature. And instead of looking for, I basically feel like some of the compliance regs are saying, you're a bunch of idiots, so we're going to force you to do something you otherwise would have done nothing. And I'm saying, well, if you can explain to someone why this is important, they may self-regulate. Even if their boss doesn't care about writing rugged software, ultimately, he who owns the compiler wins. So it's the hands on keyboards, and if they're choosing to avoid sloppy things, or if they read up on you go to their first OWASP meeting and read up on the common mistakes, then maybe, you change things one line of code at a time. So in any journey, there's multiple stages, and essentially, you got to be aware that there's a problem, right? You got to be aware of something I need to do, informed, but just enough to be dangerous. Then you have to seek more information, which is step 2. Then you can start to select which framework is best or which methodology is best for your software development shop. And then you can be mature in optimizing continuous process improvement. We've done quite a bit of work over here. If you know what BSIM is, or Building Security and Maturity Model, it's really looking on secondary metrics, second order metrics for the evidence of the things in common and highly effective, mature software development life cycles. But most of our activities over here. So this isn't really to replace any of the existing things. It's to be the onboard and the signpost pointing you to your very first OWASP meeting, or to learn about, maybe we want to have Veracode take a look at some of this stuff. Or we're going to seek out a university program that actually has an undergraduate course on writing secure software. And there's a couple folks doing that right now. So we pre-consulted quite a few people. You probably know at least 2 or 3 folks on that list. Not everybody loved it. A few on the list hated it, in fact, but they all fundamentally improved it. We did debut this at SANS AppSec, bless you. Immediately, the Department of Homeland Security has a huge budget for something called software assurance, and they're totally adopting the language wherever possible in an ad hoc way. Joe Jarzenbeck at the DHS is a huge fan. We're finding some guy was writing a book on software security and added a last chapter on how to be rugged. So it's grassroots and it's a meme, and like I said, they can be contagious or not. What we really, really need is a few leadership figures to volunteer and emerge. This is not a commercial endeavor. I happen to be the research director for 451. This is not a 451 thing. David Rice has a full-time job. Jeff Williams does. And we're really hoping to leverage ISSA, ISACA, OWASP chapters and look for individuals at universities or in government that can help move this. In fact, there's a proposal right now from the DHS for something else, which is a cyber citizen awareness campaign. And they want to adopt rugged as one of the 3 pillars. They want rugged, ready, responsible citizens. So if that proposal is accepted, then we're hoping rugged makes more sense to the layperson than secure. We've been telling them to be secure for years, and we've been doing it in a fairly negative way. For some reason, it hasn't worked. We can keep trying, or we can say, boy, if I have to get into a SaaS deployment, is it a rugged SaaS deployment? Or if I'm going to buy this CRM system versus that one, which one's been tested by White Hat or Veracode? So starting to be able to articulate the ruggedness factor of an organization, an individual, or a piece of software or something like that. Surprising to me is we wrote the manifesto for developers, but the most stickiness has come from people who are looking to buy software or on the procurement side. So there you go. There is ruggedsoftware.org with very little on it because we need more participation. There's the Rugged Software Twitter. There's a Google group, which has some activity, but not as much as I'd like to see. And here's a little bit more. I did write a paper on rugged. It's where I'm basically saying, software has become infrastructure. Just like iron and concrete, none of you are sitting in perpetual fear that this building is going to collapse upon you. You've come to take for granted and trust in this infrastructure. Software has become infrastructure, permeates every aspect of our lives, and yet it's nowhere near as reliable. It's a nearly infinite attack surface. So we got to take that modern infrastructure and make it more reliable. So you can download that paper there. That's my contact. Now, that was pretty fast, right? So in 25 minutes, I did a 50-minute presentation. So now I'd like to engage my esteemed panel here. So would you like to introduce yourselves, starting with you, Chris?
Chris Weishopel, CTO and founder of Veracode. We do software testing as a service. So I deal with a lot of developers every day who send us their code. Want to understand why I just told them it's totally broken.
Rob Sheen, CEO and founder of Safe Flight Security Advisors, and we offer information security training. I've got kind of a unique perspective on this because I've personally trained non-security people, about 10,000 developers over the last 6 years, and my company is collectively we've trained about 25,000. So we've actually been doing a lot of this stuff all along. We just didn't call it rugged. So it really resonates with me so far. So.
My name is Tiffany Rad. I'm a lawyer. I teach in the computer science department at the University of Maine, and I'm the director and founder of a hackerspace in Northern Virginia that's contractually and physically connected to a private school. And so I'm here to talk about education and how to change software practices.
My name is Lee Honeywell. I'm a computer science student at the University of Toronto, as well as one of the founders of HackLab.to in Toronto, and I'm an analyst with NSS Labs.
Okay, so we have a compressed panel format. We're not going to ask a ton of questions, but first of all, is this a horrible idea, a good idea? I know you just recently did a report, which is one of the reasons I was attracted to have you join, not to mention you're a legend in the space, but...
do we want to be passing around the mics just to
want
make
to
sure that we're capturing?
so we get recorded?
It actually sounds pretty good without
Come around. All right.
Yeah? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I showed, I told Josh about this report. It's the Veracode State of Software Security Report, and you can download it from our site for free. And so we looked at 1,600 applications that our customers had sent us over last year and a half. And, it's kind of depressing to see, how vulnerable the average piece of software is. But what was even more depressing was the two biggest categories we found were cross-site scripting and SQL injection vulnerabilities, which are very well understood. They've been well understood for 10 years now. They're easy to remediate. You just have to use the right frameworks, use the right APIs. .NET has it, Java has it, trivial. And they're still the most common vulnerabilities, which tells me that most developers don't even know about SQL injection and cross-site scripting. I think that's really telling that the majority of developers don't even know about these two very common vulnerabilities, and they're easy to fix. So it just shows you that really we're just totally missing the boat here somehow of getting the word out to developers of how to write secure software. So that's why I got interested in supporting Rugged, because there has been certainly has been more of the governance and sort of the stick approach, where embarrass the developer. Something really bad happened in their software. Okay, and now I'm gonna do something to fix that one issue, and hopefully nothing bad will happen again. And that approach obviously doesn't work. I mean, that's what we've been doing for 20 years.
Yeah, I'll just add to actually what you just said about the SQL injection cross-site scripting. When I teach, a few of you in the room have actually experienced my trainings. I always ask every room, how many of you have heard of SQL injection? How many of you have seen it? And all the hands go up when they've heard of it, most of them usually. Half of them go down when they've seen it, and you ask them, how many of you have seen it used to get root on a box? Almost all of them go down except maybe one. Same thing, cross-site scripting. How many of you have heard of it? 3/4 of the room. Half of them haven't seen it. How many of you have heard of cross-site request forgery? Like 2 hands go up. Every class, no matter who it is. Even for people you think know better. So it really is. It's a fundamental lack of awareness out there. And part of the problem really, and one of the things I'd like to throw out there about this is the way you communicate the message is important. You can't just go and say, all right, now instead of thou shalt be secure, thou shalt be rugged. That won't work. What I've seen does work, and you feel free to use any of this, is you need to get in their mindset and get in them, in the shoes of the person writing the code. They just see it as something that's a hassle. So you have to first enroll them in why they must do it. So teach them what they're up against. Show them some vulns. One thing that I've been using, I was talking to somebody last night on the way to the bar. One thing that works really well lately is describe to them Moore's law, right? Pick disk space, CPU, memory, and draw them the curve. And say, guess what? Technology moves really fast. Every 18 months, all these things double. Guess what? The hackers follow that curve really closely. And then draw them the linear curve that shows how their organization implements technology, and then show them the gap and how fast it's growing. That works. That gets their attention, right? So these little things to get their attention first, then you can start, showing them how to make it better. But if you just kind of start throwing it down their throat of, you got to do this, you got to do that, that doesn't work. So.
One of the things that I found is if you can actually teach it a little bit differently, and I'm experimenting with doing this on the high school level, but I've been doing this in the university for about 5 years now, and I'm teaching a course with information security as a big part of it, and that's not usually done in computer science. When I met Dan Guido here last year, I was really excited to meet another computer science professor that he talked about information security, because some of the departments, especially in some schools that have very traditional theory-based computer science classes, they say, well, there's IT, there's engineering, and there's computer science. And when I talk about what about information security, some of them are like, well, that's really IT, or that's really engineering. But really, a lot of people doing the software development are coming out of computer science. And it's not just good enough that your code works. You really need to consider security from the first line of code to the last. And that's something I do think that can be taught in the entry-level, introduction to computer programming classes at universities, but it isn't really. I teach a 500-level class right now. I'm trying to get the university to bring it down or offer a 100, 200-level course, because this is where it really needs to start early in the foundation for software engineering and for hardware engineering. And likewise, I don't think there's a huge division anymore between computer science and the hardware part, like software and hardware. With firmware, and it's all kind of the same right now, the way the products are being developed. So I'm really pushing my students to learn more about the electronics aspect of not just this is the code, but how does it work in the actual product. And likewise, in fact, I teach a class and I talk about hacking and information security, and sometimes I get some friction from some more senior faculty members saying, well, are you teaching your students to be hackers? I've actually asked this question, and they asked me, well, so you're teaching them to do buffer overflows? And I said, no, in fact, I'm not teaching them to do buffer overflows. We learned that in your class in computer architecture. What I'm teaching them to do is recognize what it is. When you're assessing a product or when you're developing something, know what it is and don't do it. But just knowing theoretically this is a buffer overflow, which should not be happening. I mean, again, we've known about buffer overflows for a long time now. But this is where I'm trying to do more with universities to get information security classes in the computer science department, not push it off to IT.
And it doesn't even necessarily need to be an entire class. In my entire computer science major, of all of the actual core required classes, there is a single line in a single slide in the second year class where you learn a bit of C that says, oh, and by the way, don't do this, you'll get a buffer overflow. That is the entire required content related to security in the entire program. And this is the best research university in Canada, which is usually classed around the University of Michigan. even if that one line was 10 minutes of that one class, rather than even trying to get a required security course in a program, I think that that would have an incredibly dramatic impact on the consciousness of students that are coming out of that program. And that's where I think, like, that's what's attracted me to this idea, to this meme, to this manifesto, is even if it's just that 10 minutes, that can change a developer's attitude.
So there's a number of directions I could take. You guys reminded me of some things I normally say in the non-speedy version, but we've had some conversations, very valuable conversations in the last few days about where does this belong and whose responsibility is it? And just like safety, this is everybody's responsibility, right? So oftentimes it's an economic thing, and we had a debate this morning with Marianne before her keynote about are there strong economic disincentives for software developers to write more secure code? And one of my conspirators up there, David Rice, he wrote a book called Geekonomics where he basically says it's more expensive to write good code, so the builders of software aren't incented to do so. It's also more expensive to buy more secure code, so the buy side of supply and demand doesn't really demand it. And there's some problems in his arguments and whatnot, but essentially this isn't simply a matter of a bit flip in the hearts and minds of the developers. It's also going to have to be tipping the economics such that people would vote with their wallets or put language into RFPs, and that's been one of the more promising things I've seen. I know we've talked about this, but if the buyers of software, kind of revolt and say, we don't want your software to put my company at risk with a lot of this stuff lately, they may start demanding or putting contract language in. So I'm curious what the take is on how much of this is an economics thing and how much, it can't simply be a hearts and minds thing, but how much is education, how much of this is students, how much of this is existing practitioners, how much of this is the software providers, and how much of this is the buy side? I know it's kind of a loaded question, but how do we fight the multiple fronts of this particular problem? Anybody?
I'll go. You definitely can't, you can never extract the economics of it because there's a reality that it costs a certain amount of extra money to do it. One thing I've seen is that when people start from scratch, then it's expensive in the beginning, but over time they just start incorporating it into what they do. It just becomes part of what they do, and the nominal additional cost is actually not that much because it's just part of what we do now. So I think over time that curve goes down. It never goes down to zero, but it definitely goes down. And for kind of factoring in, show people the cost of the famous study done by IBM of the $1 bug that cost $6.50 in if you find it when you're writing code, and $15 in QA and $60 in production. Like that works, because it's very clear. The more rework you have to do, the more it's going to cost in the long run. It's going to be more expensive once you have the incident. Some of the things that we talk about, the remediation costs are so low compared to the cost of one incident, and it blows my mind that they're not doing that math and factoring things like their reputation into it. And I do think that it does have to kind of address your other point. In a lot of ways, it does have to be addressed by the people buying the software. Some of my, larger customers, they absolutely incorporate it into their process now and say, we will not buy software that's not secure. Now, it's not perfect because sometimes the line of business that wants the software says, well, we really, really, really want this. And, can we just let it slide this one time? At some point they're starting to say, no, it's not acceptable anymore. And the conversation that I'm hearing from, pushback from the vendors is interesting because vendors who should know better are pushing back and saying, oh, well, it's okay for our other Fortune 500 customers. What's wrong with you? So, at that point you have to just draw the line somewhere and say, well, tough. You have to follow our methodologies and make sure that it shouldn't be unreasonable to ask a vendor, show me the result of a pen test from a reputable vendor. That should not be unreasonable at all. And people are getting pushback on that, especially from vendors that aren't traditionally security vendors. They're like, what's a pen test? Anyway, that's enough.
Yeah, I don't think it's that expensive, to tell you the truth, like you're saying, to build it in. I mean, the biggest thing, if you take the example of SQL injection and cross-site scripting, it's not that expensive to write an application that doesn't have SQL injection or cross-site scripting. It's using different APIs and being aware of them. And then, of course, you should do some testing to make sure that you don't have that. But if you have a product line that's you're making millions of dollars in revenue to have $10,000 of security testing on there.
Yeah.
It's pretty trivial if you think about it. So I don't really buy the
Sometimes it's driven by the arrogance of the people designing the systems, that they're like, well, my system is secure, or they think you're full of crap, or you have to show them the vulnerability. But when you actually break it apart and show them how you can really get in, then suddenly they're like, oh, maybe it wasn't so secure after all.
And I think it's also partly related to the sort of ghettoization of QA within the software development lifecycle, and how that's like outside of security that's so dramatically undervalued. And for that reason, it isn't seen as being sort of part of what you need to do in your development lifecycle.
Yeah, I always joke with the developing groups. I say, all right, we always have these release dates that never slip, and then we always have development deadlines that always do, and it's like a vice that just crushes QA, and QA falls out into the floor. And then I ask the question, was security testing even incorporated in there in the first place? Or was it just QA that fell out? And usually the answer is they didn't think about security at all in the first place. You have a question?
A question from the Twitter sphere. What is the trade-off to do a more secure coding program and rugged software?
That's a pretty broad question.
Well, hopefully you're lowering costs of incident response, product incident response team, your PR efforts, brand damage, right? So you're lowering those, but it is going to be more expensive to build the secure software. I just don't think it's that much more expensive. I have customers that can train their development teams and incorporate security testing in for maybe $10,000, $20,000. We're not talking a huge amount of money. I mean, there's a lot of automated testing tools. There's online training that isn't that expensive.
Right, and make no mistake, the cost of incidents is going to keep going up, because a lot of companies have been able to mitigate some of their cost by having insurance. There's only so many times those hits are going to happen before the insurance companies raise the premium so high that it's negligent to not do it.
Yeah, I actually have insurance companies coming to me and asking me, what questions should I be asking the people I'm insuring? What questions should I ask them about? Are they looking at security in their acquisition of their IT technology? And the obvious conclusion there is the rates are going to be higher for people that aren't incorporating any kind of security in their acquisition programs.
One of the hopes out of the rugged community is that as we've been doing this, there's always someone that comes up to me later and says, oh, this is how I sold security or an SDL to my business. Here was the math I used. Here was the pie charts I used. I demonstrated it. We got budget. We proved its value. We used vendor XYZ. So we're kind of hoping to either collect these and make a repository so people can reuse them. It's not an impossible thing. It's just that we don't have the experience and knowledge on how to do it or sell it. So part of the idea here is as we get more participation, which has been the biggest problem, as we get more participation, people will be able to share these success stories with each other. Yep.
I'm not completely convinced that in the long run, implementing security winds up being more expensive. If you think about the kinds of protection mechanisms that one might implement, such as input validation in all interfaces, right? My suspicion is that that's not only going to fix security bugs, that's going to fix a lot of functional bugs, right?
Right.
And
Secure code is robust code.
If that is the case, then that would be a very strong argument for cost reduction, because you're sort of getting, double for the effort. But I don't know of any studies that have actually tried to look at that. I don't know how such studies could be constructed. But that seems to me like one area where one could, potentially launch some studies. And if that winds up being true, that could be quoted as often as, how expensive it is to fix a bug in implementation.
Right. I mean, we've been saying that for years. I mean, back when we were at AppStake, we would write reports. We'd have to go in and convince people that they needed to spend money on the security thing. And that was one of our arguments, was that if you build in security, you get robust code as a side benefit, so everybody wins. You're gonna have less downtime and less maintenance time in the long run.
The Canadian on the panel pointed out there's a Canadian in the back who's been patient. So.
All right.
I just want to say I completely disagree that secure code will cost more money. In fact, insecure code in the long run will cost more money, just because I've managed software engineers, product managers, or software firm, and the initial cost will be more to make secure code. It would increase your timelines, it would increase your QA cycles, and it would increase your go-to-market targets. But over the long run, you're going to save your money in your support calls, in your sales team, in your QA retesting to try and find the bug, and then in money that you're spending to get the engineers to fix it later on. So over long term, it is going to cost you more money to wait for your code.
Absolutely.
We've all seen that.
Yeah, I think in the choir we figured that out,
Yeah.
and that's why we're doing that.
Yeah.
I think what we need to do is we need to get that message across to the management of these organizations, CSOs, VPs of engineering, so they get it. VPs of marketing, CEOs, and then they can start to incorporate things into their their culture of their company. That software security related, and I've started to see that happen at some large companies. Microsoft has started doing this, having presentations at their MSDN conferences. They're actually doing presentations on security to developers. So, I mean, this was unheard of like 5 years ago. You go to a developer conference and hear about security. So obviously Microsoft gets it. I was at a Fortune 50 company which woke up one day and said, "Hey, wait a minute, we have like 5,000 developers. We're a software company, even though they're not. They're a big conglomerate." And they said, "We need to, get a handle on and start to act like a software company." And so we need to get together and get all our architects together, and we have to all have them all thinking the same and having common processes and like that. And so they had a 5-day bringing all the software leaders together, and they spent the whole day on security. They said, well, if I'm going to get all the software leaders in one place, company-wide, for 5 days, let's spend 1 day on security. So, I mean, that's because the CSO at the company is very, enlightened to the impact of the software. So, I mean, I'm starting to see it a little bit.
Yeah.
And another thing that I can say is if you wait until you get the lawyers involved, that's when it gets really expensive. Some of us that do a lot with computer law, we are seeing possibly some federal legislation here in the U.S. coming down the line for tort liability. And so right now, if the market doesn't make their software more rugged, it looks like if the federal government gets involved, that's when things get expensive for liability, tort liabilities, such as we have this with products liability. So it's concerning to think about this, but of the companies that come to me and I do some IP filings for them, I cannot stress how concerned I am when some of them come in and they say, well, we're really going to protect our code and the usage of it with the DMCA, with patents, things like that. So they're using pieces of legislation to kind of
eyebrow twitch.
Yeah, to if you break into this, we're going to get you on a patent violation. That type of stuff, that's not good security. But so I'm just suggesting, don't leave it to the lawyers or the legislatures. If we can manage this within the software community, I think that'd be better than what we might see a couple years down the line.
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally a logistics problem in a lot of cases because you have tens of thousands of companies, you have 6.7 billion people on the planet, and there's only a small number of us to get the message out there. We are making progress. I've seen tremendous progress in the last 10 years. Now, of course, there's more attacks than ever, but we've still made a lot of progress if you actually look at what's going on. If you look at what Microsoft is doing as an example, what Oracle's doing, these different groups. Now, one thing I would throw out there, though, is we kind of need to clean up our own house first because we got security vendors out there saying they have things that are 100% secure, which is complete bullshit, and we all know that. Call them on it. Ooh, the pin just dropped. I heard that.
I think to all of us, it's kind of a duh concept, to get it right at the beginning, because maintenance is always the most expensive part. We kind of think of ourselves as more a new or different industry, but really you can look at anything from car manufacturing on up, and there are hundreds of case studies of systems engineering where they show that if you get it right in the design phase, it's cheaper overall, by a lot.
There's a lot of I'm sorry.
I was just going to say a lot of this is just recognizing that what we're talking about here with designing secure software is part of that design phase. It's part of the spit shine before you send the car off the end of the line.
So a lot of our analogies for this, in fact, a little bit of how the sausage was made, the original intent on this was not just to be a contagious meme. When we were lamenting at RSA last year, we were saying, what we need is, just like the auto industry, they resisted the 5-star crash rating system, right? They totally resisted. They said it was going to ruin the whole industry.
Now it's a marketing point.
And now they're actually thinking of adding a 6th star to further differentiate. I mean, people who want safe cars will pay extra for the safest car. So there are a lot of analogies, and we were looking for what's the 5-star crash rating system for ruggedness. You know, another idea was how can you objectively certify a programmer to be a rugged one so they can differentiate themselves in a crowded market. And ultimately we realized that, you know, we got a lot of certifications and a lot of tools, so let's just start first with, is this something sticky people would value and seek? There's a Walmart example that David Rice uses, that Walmart started adding this environmental sustainability index. So if you can buy toothpaste that's $1 or toothpaste that's $1.10, but next to it's a more sustainable one, if you care about that, you'll pay the extra 10 cents because you can now differentiate because we're describing it. And I'm kind of hoping that this could evolve, and there's efforts from independent vendors to do seals of approval or validation. And I think that's the beginning of doing this. And this might take 5 or 10 years, but if the concept is at all attractive to the choir, I'm strenuously asking that we weave the rugged language into our vernacular and start sharing it more.
One thing, I just was in the Adobe presentation, the Adobe P-Cert, and they said that internally at Adobe, they have a karate-style belt system for their developers. And in the Adobe directory, when you look up a person, they'll actually have their security belt color, if they have one, will be there. So if they take the basic developer training, they get a white belt. If they take a more in-depth training, they get a brown belt. Green belt. And then if they actually do they sort of do a security project, like they build a fuzzer for their product that they're doing or something like that, they get the brown belt. And then I'm not sure how they get the black belt, but those are the guys in the security team, so they probably designed it.
I just wanted to see, who here has seen nerd merit badges?
Oh, yeah,
we need a rugged merit badge.
That's right.
It runs the risk though of becoming another checklist type thing. They just I don't want it to turn into another PCI where it's like because there's 2 ways to do PCI, right? You can do the checklist of firewall check, or you can take the spirit of it. And the companies I know that look for the spirit behind the rules, those are the ones that get it. But how do you do this and have people actually get the spirit of it, and not just follow the letter of the law to get the stupid little steal on their website?
You in the back?
So, you're discussing a lot about how the development community has failed and how we need to get them to do things. Well, what we overlook a lot is the format string vulnerabilities, which don't exist anymore, but mostly because developers realize they exist. You're creating while you're discussing originally with the agile development, how it might be the antithesis of security or it might be good or bad, you're overlooking the fact, I believe, that you need to look at the development life cycles and how one guy will miss something. The best and most secure coders in the world have written great codes like, what's better than stern copy? Stern copy buffs stir arbitrary network info. So a tweet from someone I know that came from probably one of the most secure pieces of software you will ever imagine. And the thing is, if you're focusing more on making this a meme than an educational effort, because buffer overflows are hard to do anymore. And we can't patronize these developers, and we're not. We just aren't teaching them. We're not showing them this is why the race condition dies.
But you're talking about a specific set of developers, right? Because the application developers in corporations aren't writing in C and C++ anymore. So they're not really hitting the format strings, the buffer overflows. They're writing in Java and .NET, and they're coding a SQL injection like you wouldn't believe.
And they've never heard of CSRF.
Right, they've never even heard of it.
They've just never heard of it. And which is the same thing as you're saying fundamentally. And a lot of the Rugged Manifesto is originally just a manifesto, but there are other efforts that people are sort of starting to talk about that are specifically about educating people.
I've actually encountered several firms that do, yours is one of them, that do training for developers, very exhaustive training, in-person training, computer training, topic-based courses. And, like I said, the 3 of us that started this, this is not our job. This is an idea we want to promote and push to get people to look at their first OWASP chapter, to get people to go to a school or take a class that might, like Dan Guido, you're in the room here. So you did this at, New York Poly, right? So start to like point people, even if it's simply a registry on our website that says, here are universities that have a course that you could take. So if someone heard about this,
Even if it's putting up posters around the comp sci building telling people when the next OWASP meeting is.
Right.
yeah.
You have a question, Brett?
Yeah, one of the points that I rarely ever hear, but I think has a big impact as far as cost and security, is end of life. Too many companies don't end of life legacy code. Legacy code tends to be one of the biggest, most ugly things, and the most expensive thing to fix because of backwards compatibility. If you're still supporting a piece of software that's been around for 15 years, and you have to fix it, think of the complexity of fixing it in a way that the customer doesn't bring. I think one of the things that we need to work into these ideas is the fact that we need to teach and educate people that end of life is important from a security perspective and the cost.
Absolutely. I still have some customers who shall remain nameless, of course, that have client server applications that are, old school client server applications, application talking directly to the database that move like, $40 billion a day in financial transactions. It's ridiculous. And having that be incorporated into that and educating them on the fact that, at some point you got to just call this thing done and write a new one that is using more modern techniques.
In those events, the rewrite is actually cheaper.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. They didn't get the risks of supporting this kind of old legacy application.
But what you're talking about there actually is expensive. To rebuild an application, that's going to cost a lot of money.
That's the hardest sell, but I mean, the idea behind actually end of life and having a plan, right? Because most companies write it and say, well, we're done. Sure, over here. Let's continue on with something else.
Until the magic smoke leaves the machine, this thing will keep running.
So we got our 5-minute warning 10 minutes ago, and there's a lot more hands, and I suggest we need to talk about it over beverages. But this is just a glimpse. I mean, this is going to start small. It might not work. It might work. All I know is it seems to be working and sticking with non-security folks a whole lot better than calling their code crappy gigs or telling them they should be secure.
Yeah, telling them they suck doesn't work, and saying, thou shalt do this, that definitely doesn't work. You got to take a different approach to the communication of the message.
And the last point is, and I'm going to talk about this on Saturday at B-Sides, is we are a very hostile industry. We tend to eat our own and look for everything wrong in each other's ideas. And so far, the ones I've seen that have worked elsewhere in this industry are when people look for what's right in an idea and help us accentuate the good and mitigate the bad. So I'm hoping that, warts and all, people will take a nurturing attitude towards this, spread the word, get involved, drag a buddy to an OWASP meeting. Because what I've found is when people start to get a glimpse at security, it's pretty interesting to them. It's not a burden, it's not a crutch, it's something they tend to find a lot of value in. So please be nurturing, please be rugged, and please spread the word.
On that note, it doesn't work for the non-security professionals at all. And there needs to be more translation done and it sounds silly sometimes because it seems so obvious to us because we live it and we know the lingo, we know how it works. You really have to kind of, quote unquote, dumb it down a little bit just to be able to clearly communicate what it is that you're actually talking about. Because if you just say, oh, you're vulnerable to CSRF, they're like, what the hell is that?
Yeah, it's not even about dumbing it down, it's about first principles.
Right.
They don't have that grounding.
Yeah, it's just like, we're talking about martial arts as an example. Like, you know what you do when you learn when you're a black belt in karate? You do blocks and kicks and punches. It's the same thing. You teach people the basics and break it down
Wax on,
in a way.
wax off.
Wax on, wax on. Exactly. So we need to do more of that, more teaching, and not so much just go read this advisory, because developers that don't know security, they don't know how to do that. It doesn't mean anything to them. So try to look for ways to communicate in ways that are a little bit more straightforward. That's all I got.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.